Hello everyone, this is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Authentication, identification, or just knowing who you are communicating with can prevent payment fraud from deepfakes and other scenarios. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 300, Authentication Works Against Deepfakes. Get free training and a reference template to put it into place and avoid payment fraud. Well, this was another long title, but you know what? I don't even care. I am very happy today. First of all, it is the 300th episode, and I kept wondering what I was going to do for it, and all of a sudden it just appeared in my inbox where I saw an article by Bloomberg, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. But the article's title was, "I Need to Identify You. How One Question Saved Ferrari from a Deep Fake Scam." And if any of you know about my framework, Authentication Validation Management, if you've been following my podcast, I talk about it all the time. And the first step is authentication. And that word may just not be like the right word, but I like it. But it's really just identifying who you are speaking to, who you're communicating with, or whom you are receiving vendor documents from. You need to make sure that they are who they say they are. And so I have been saying that in that framework for actually since I came out on my own as a consultant in 2018. And so it's been, and that was September of 2018. And as of today, it's July or August of 2018. So it's been about 6 years. And it's really great to see this article from Bloomberg that really supports it. And I think part of the issue is that in the beginning, it just seemed like an extra thing to do that was going to annoy people. But I think, especially with this article, and as people start to use it and understand that it's really the only way that you're going to verify who people are, right? Because we don't always know the vendors and accounts payable or the vendor team. It's really the only way. So I do want to just go over this article really quick because it's a great example. And it's with, again, Ferrari, and Benito Vigna was impersonated on a call using AI software. And we already know that there have been other fraud scams that have been reported based on deepfake audio because the person receiving the call thought that it was the actual person that they said they were. In one case, a $35 million case, it was I believe it was a controller that received a call from their finance director, and they knew the finance director, and it still worked. But in any event, this deepfake audio was one that was not successful. And I'm going to read part of the article to so you can see what the scenario was. And so one day, it was a Tuesday, a executive started receiving a bunch of unexpected messages, seemingly from the CEO. And the CEO said, "Hey, did you hear about the big acquisition we're planning? I need your help." And that was one of the messages, right? And so the next message or another message came to say, right, be ready to sign the non-disclosure agreement. Our lawyer is set to send you ASAP. And so it sounds like it's something that would be done if there was an acquisition. But instead of following our cognitive behaviors that are just inbred, that the fraudsters rely on, one of which is authority bias, right? Where we just want to please, right, that leadership role. And so instead of following that, he didn't. What he did is he said, "Sorry, Benedetto, but I need to identify you." And he posed a question. What was the title of the book Vigna had just recommended to him a few days earlier? And guess what? The fraudster hung up because they did not know. So wouldn't that be great if you could thwart not only deepfake audios and maybe even deepfake videos with some type of a question that only your leadership or only someone at your vendor's place of business or only an internal team member would know, leaving the fraudster with no choice but to hang up because they don't know it. And what are they going to do when they hang up? They're going to go to the next potential victim that is not asking those questions. And it doesn't just have to be by phone. It could also be by email or on a video call so that you can thwart those deep fake videos. And what I really like about this is that it shows that the employee was not afraid to ask a leadership position an identifying question so that they could avoid fraud. Because many times I see where some team members don't want to ask leadership those types of questions because they think they're going to be annoyed. They think that they don't understand the reason why. But the issue really is that you're protecting your leadership, you're protecting yourself, you're protecting your company, you're protecting your vendor from fraud. So I love to see that this has happened. Now, this happened because there was a phone call, but again, it can be done via email. It could also be done on conference calls where video is involved. But there are a couple other scenarios too when this can be done or when I recommend that it be done. Now, the first scenario I've talked about a lot, and that is when you are receiving documents from your vendor or your internal team member if they collect documents on behalf of the vendor to send them to you. And let's say your internal team member sends them outside of the work email, or maybe that email itself has some suspicious verbiage or has some red flags and you're just not sure. You can invoke this at any point by asking 2 to 3 identifying questions, because you want to make sure you're actually getting those documents from your vendor or from your internal team member and not from a fraudster. And so you can ask 2 to 3 identifying questions in email and have those 2 to 3 identifying questions replied back to and answered. So you can make sure that you are not receiving those documents from a fraudster. So that's one, when you're receiving documents to update add a vendor in your vendor master file or update an existing vendor in your vendor master file. The next one is when you're doing that confirmation call. Yes, you may think, well, why do I have to do that? Well, there have been many instances where that confirmation call, bank change or remittance address change, because fraudsters are trying to get vendors check payments diverted to them as well, is not just the ACH or banking details to get the ACH payments. They're also trying to change remittance addresses to get the checks sent to them so they can whitewash them and commit check fraud. And you may not think it's happening, but it is happening. The confirmation call is being made to the contact information in the email request, which if it's fraudulent, that means that the fraudster is going to be contacted. And of course, they are going to say that the request for remittance change is valid. However, if in that phone call, that confirmation call, you require a script to be read by all of the team members, right? You know what they're going to say, and so you include a line for authentication. So when that phone call is made, they first will confirm the last 5 digits of the existing routing number, the last 5 digits of the bank account number that is on file. And that way, you know that you are communicating with your vendor and not a fraudster. Now, it could be that the vendor is a check payment vendor existing, and now they're converting to ACH payments. So you don't have a bank account number and a routing number that you can use to authenticate, but you can use other identifying information to, again, make sure they are who they say they are. Now, and I'll talk about that in a minute with the free training. So that was another scenario. So we've had 2 so far. When you're receiving vendor documents for vendor add or change. And then the second one is when you're making that confirmation call, because you want to make sure that whomever is doing that confirmation call, that they're reading from a script and that that script includes authentication. Now, another scenario where you can ask those identifying questions so that you authenticate whoever you're communicating with or accepting documents from is actually your vendor or your internal team member and not a fraudster, is when you are collecting those documents, for example, for a change on the vendor master file. So let's say you have a vendor that is requesting a bank change, then on your company branded ACH form, your vendor banking template, whatever you want to call it, and you should have your own, have some authenticating data on there. So I always talk about ask for the existing banking when they want to change banking to a new bank account, right? Because they should have it, because if they have access and authority to get the new banking information, they should have access and authority to get the old banking information. So that should be on your form as well. But another piece of identifying information that can authenticate is the actual team member, internal team member that they have a relationship with. Now, this could be a buyer for purchase order vendors, or it could be an internal team member that is using the vendor for a non-PO type purchase. And what's really great about that is you can request that internal team member on that banking form that I talked about, but you can also have your own vendor setup form where you are also using that form for changes, and you can ask for the internal team member that they have a relationship with for either new vendor setups or changes. It works for both. And the way that it thwarts fraudsters, right, is because, yes, they can go on LinkedIn and they can find an internal employee that they can put in that field, but they still don't know if you are going to reach out to that internal employee or not, right? And so why take that chance? They'll just abandon the request and they'll go on again to the next potential victim that's not asking those questions. So I am sure if I think about it some more, there will be more scenarios, and maybe even you too, because maybe you have some unique processes in your vendor setup and maintenance process for your industry, for your company, right? Where you can ask those identifying questions and just call it whatever you want to call it. I call it authentication. You can call it identification, whatever you want to call it. Just ask those identifying questions to make sure that you are communicating with or accepting documents from who you think you are accepting them from and not from a fraudster. Now, let's talk about some free training so that you can put this into place at your company. So I have the framework, Authentication Validation Management, that I just talked about. It has 5 authentication techniques, 29 internal controls, 17 best practices, and 16 vendor validations. And that first step of authentication in that workshop training session that I have set up is free. So I am going to put a link to that in the show notes. And what also comes with that free section is an authentication reference template. And in that template, I have some recommended data elements or questions, identifying questions that you can ask, or right, you can customize it and make up your own. And sometimes you don't even need to follow that. In this case, the person that was being targeted, right, knew the person that was being deepfaked. And so they had a personal relationship. And so he asked for a personal identifying question, right, about the book. But you won't always have that with your vendors or maybe not even your internal team members. So you do have to have some type of data elements that you can ask to authenticate who it is you're communicating with. And so I've provided some of those for you, but make sure you customize it based on your company, your vendors, your industry. And I will say to that too, I always get asked about a PIN number, and I actually did a customized fraud training yesterday for a company. And I was asked when I got to the section about authentication, if they could use a coded like password or PIN number that only their team knows. And that takes me back to, and I don't know if I talked about it on this platform before or not, but I watched a movie that had Jerry Lewis in it. And Jerry Lewis used to be teamed up with Dean Martin, and they had a lot of comedies out there, but this one, it was a very serious movie, a drama, and he was an entertainer, and he got kidnapped by one of his fans, and actually the fan was Robert De Niro, so that was the reason that I watched the movie. But anyway, he got kidnapped, and so when he called from the kidnapper's place, he called the studio, and he had a code that he told the studio so that the studio would know that that was him. And that was back in 1975. So yes, you can have a password, you can have a PIN number, but just make sure it never gets into email, it never gets into Slack, and make sure you change it often as well, because it does work. When you push back and when you ask the fraudster identifying questions that they do not have the answers to. They're not on LinkedIn. They're not on Facebook. The answers are not in email. They are not in Slack. They're not on other platforms that can be hacked into and accessed by the fraudster. Then the fraudster has no choice but to hang up. So make them hang up. Make them abandon the email conversation and go on to the next potential victim that is not pushing back and asking those identifying questions. All right, so that is all I have for today's 300th episode, and I am so glad that I saw this article out there by Bloomberg. It is the perfect topic for a 300 episode or 300 podcast episode where I have been saying the same thing since the first episode. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 300th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.